It began as a hushed exchange behind palace doors, one that aides moved quickly to bury. But the expression on Catherine's face as she stepped into the corridor told a different story entirely. Something had shaken the inner circle, and somehow, young Charlotte was at the center of it. What started as a dismissed whisper was now spiraling into something far more explosive. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, the meeting itself raised more questions than answers. It wasn't scheduled, it wasn't announced, and according to those who quietly track the rhythms of royal life, it disrupted a day that had otherwise been carefully mapped out weeks in advance. Catherine and William were said to have been joined by senior advisors and, more unusually, medical consultants, an inclusion that immediately sparked concern among those familiar with how tightly controlled such access typically is. Reports suggest the conversation was intense, layered with pauses and lowered voices, as if every word carried consequences beyond the room itself. And yet, no official acknowledgement followed, no statement, no reassurance, only silence, the kind that feels deliberate rather than accidental. That silence, insiders whisper, was not ordinary. Palace staff, often accustomed to managing speculation, were reportedly instructed to refrain from even informal discussion. Conversations were cut short. Movements were logged with greater scrutiny. It was, as one observer described, an atmosphere that felt sealed, as though something fragile needed protecting not just from the public, but from within. At the heart of it all was Princess Charlotte, whose name began to surface in hushed tones across administrative corridors, not in alarm, but in concern. Not dramatic, not immediate, but enough to unsettle those who rarely show it. Catherine's reaction only deepened the mystery. Usually composed, measured, and unwavering in public and private appearances alike, she was reportedly seen leaving the meeting pale, her expression betraying a momentary loss of control. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but in an environment where every gesture is noted, it was enough. William, by contrast, seemed to shift into something quieter but more resolute. Later that evening, according to various interpretations of palace movement logs, he remained close to Charlotte, his presence less ceremonial and more protective, as if instinct had overtaken protocol. For weeks, subtle signs had been building. Media insiders now claim that something had felt off in recent appearances, small deviations, slight hesitations, moments that didn't align with the carefully maintained image of stability. At the time, they were dismissed as overanalysis, the kind that often surrounds public figures. But now, those fragments are being re-examined, stitched together into a narrative that suggests this moment was not sudden, but the culmination of something quietly unfolding behind the scenes. And yet, even as concerns circled around Charlotte, there was an undercurrent, something unspoken but persistent, that hinted this situation was not isolated. Because in a structure as intricate as the royal family, nothing exists in a vacuum. Every decision, every reaction, every silence carries echoes of something larger, something older, something tied not just to individuals but to legacy itself. But the truth emerging wasn't just about Charlotte. It pointed toward a clash that reached far deeper into the royal bloodline. What seemed like a minor disagreement between children, according to palace whispers, carried the weight of something far more serious. Because the other child involved wasn't just anyone, it was a direct descendant tied to Camilla's side of the family. And suddenly, a simple incident began to look like the spark of a much older rivalry. At first, those closest to the situation attempted to frame it as nothing more than an ordinary clash, something fleeting, something that would fade as quickly as it appeared. But within the palace's tightly woven inner network, that explanation didn't hold. Because lineage in this world is never just background, it is everything. And the presence of Camilla's granddaughter, a figure quietly positioned within the extended orbit of royal life through the Parker Bowles line, immediately shifted the tone of what had occurred. This was no longer just about two children. It was about two branches of a family that had never fully settled into harmony. Reports suggest the connection itself had always carried a certain tension. On one side stood the direct heirs, raised under the unyielding weight of expectation, tradition, and future responsibility. On the other, a lineage adjacent to the throne, close enough to feel its influence, yet never bound by its strictest demands. That difference, subtle on the surface, has long been described by insiders as a quiet divide, one shaped not by open conflict but by contrasting worlds, different rules, different pressures, different understandings of what it means to belong. And within that divide, observers now believe something had been building, not openly, not dramatically, but steadily. Small moments, barely noticeable at the time, now take on new meaning when viewed together. A shift in tone during shared gatherings, a hesitation where there had once been ease. Insiders whisper that the households, while outwardly united, had begun to operate with an increasing sense of distance. Not hostility, but caution. Not conflict, but awareness, as if both sides understood that proximity did not guarantee alignment. The reported altercation, brief as it may have been, forced that underlying tension into the open. Accounts remain carefully guarded, but those familiar with the situation describe a moment where emotions surfaced faster than protocol could contain them. Raised voices, a breakdown in the careful composure expected even at the youngest levels of royal life, and a reaction that immediately signaled this was not something to be dismissed lightly. Charlotte, raised within the strict framework of duty and expectation, found herself in a situation that challenged not just her patience, but the very environment designed to protect her from such moments. What makes this more complex, according to royal observers, is not the act itself, but what it represents. Because in a family where every gesture is layered with meaning, even a fleeting disagreement can become symbolic. And here, symbolism carries weight. It speaks of boundaries, who stands where, who belongs to which circle, and how those circles intersect or collide. The incident, therefore, is no longer being viewed as isolated. It is being interpreted as a reflection of something deeper, something that has existed quietly beneath the surface for far longer than anyone publicly acknowledged. And that is where the unease grows. Because once an incident crosses from personal to symbolic, it stops being contained. It begins to ripple outward, touching not just those directly involved, but the structure surrounding them. Questions begin to form about influence, about proximity, about the invisible lines that define the modern monarchy. And in those questions lies a tension that cannot easily be dismissed or smoothed over with silence. As the palace continues to hold its position, refusing to confirm or deny, the narrative continues to evolve beyond its control. Because the more tightly something is contained, the more intensely it is examined. And now, what began as a private moment between two young individuals is being reframed as something far more significant, a signal, perhaps, of a shifting balance that few are willing to openly address. And what happened next would transform a private disagreement into a matter of royal consequence. Behind carefully closed doors, accounts of the moment began to circulate, and none of them were simple. Raised voices, a brief physical confrontation, and witnesses who immediately understood the gravity of what they had seen. This wasn't just children behaving badly. This was something the palace could not afford to let surface. What followed was not clarity, but contradiction. Different versions of the same moment began to emerge from within the palace's tightly controlled inner circle, each one slightly altered, each one carefully incomplete. Some insiders described a sudden escalation and exchange that shifted from words to something more physical in a matter of seconds. Others insisted it was over almost as quickly as it began, a fleeting loss of composure rather than a sustained conflict. But what remained consistent across every account was the reaction that followed, because those who witnessed it did not treat it as minor. They responded as if something far more serious had just occurred. Security staff, according to various interpretations, moved with unusual speed, not aggressively, but decisively, the kind of response reserved for moments that carry implications beyond the immediate. Aides followed closely behind, not to reprimand, but to contain. Voices were lowered. Movement was redirected. The situation was, in every sense, sealed off from the outside before it had the chance to spread. And in that rapid containment, the palace revealed something without ever saying it outright, that whatever had just happened could not be allowed to exist beyond those walls. Charlotte, at the center of it all, was described in conflicting yet revealing ways. Shaken, some said. Composed, others insisted. But even within those differences, there was a shared understanding that she had been affected. Not visibly, not in a way that would disrupt appearances, but internally, in a way that only those closest to her could fully recognize. And that distinction mattered. Because in a world where emotional control is instilled from the earliest age, even a subtle shift can signal something deeper. Questions began to surface almost immediately, though never publicly. Not accusations, Not confrontations but quiet considerations about how such a moment could occur at all. Who was present? Who was responsible for oversight? And perhaps most importantly, what environment had allowed tensions to reach that point? These were not questions meant for headlines. They were internal, measured, and deliberate. But their existence alone hinted at a recognition that this was not just about what happened, but about what led to it. The decision to suppress the incident came quickly, and according to those familiar with palace protocol, it was absolute. No external reporting, no acknowledgement, no room for speculation to take root beyond what could be tightly managed. It was a calculated move, one that reflected both experience and caution, because the palace has long understood that once a narrative escapes its control, it takes on a life of its own. And this, above all else, was a narrative they were not prepared to release. Yet even as the story was contained, its impact continued to expand within the confines of the institution. Silence, while effective on the surface, often amplifies what lies beneath. The more tightly the situation was held, the more intensely it was examined by those within. And in that examination, the incident began to shift once again from an event to a turning point. Not because of what was seen, but because of what it revealed about the fragile balance that had been quietly maintained until now. Because beneath the layers of protocol and protection, something had been exposed. Not dramatically, not publicly, but undeniably. A crack, however small, in a system built on control. And once a crack appears, it cannot simply be ignored. It must be addressed, managed, reframed. And that is where the story begins to move beyond containment and into action. Because while the palace worked to contain the story, one figure was already preparing a response. For those watching closely, the shift was unmistakable. William's demeanor changed, calmer on the surface, but far more controlled beneath it. This was no longer about damage control. It was about drawing a line, and insiders suggest that line would be enforced in a way few had anticipated. What made this transformation so striking was not its visibility, but its precision. William did not react impulsively. There were no outward displays of frustration, no emotional declarations. Instead, there was a quiet tightening of control, a deliberate recalibration that those familiar with royal patterns immediately recognized. Reports suggest that within hours of the incident, channels of communication began to shift. Conversations that once flowed informally were now routed through structured pathways. Decisions that might have been shared became concentrated. It was subtle, but unmistakable, an assertion of authority that did not need to be announced to be understood. Behind the scenes, consultations reportedly began almost immediately, not just with advisors, but with figures deeply embedded in the constitutional and legal framework that governs the monarchy's inner workings. These were not casual discussions. They were measured, strategic, and layered with implication. Because when boundaries within the royal structure are reconsidered, they are not adjusted lightly. They are examined, defined, and reinforced with a level of care that reflects their long-term impact. And in this case, the focus was clear protection, not just in the immediate sense, but in the broader context of future stability. At the center of every decision was Charlotte, not as a symbol, not as a figurehead, but as a child whose position carries both privilege and vulnerability in equal measure. Insiders suggest that William's approach became singular in its intent: to ensure that her environment remained controlled, secure, and free from any influence that could disrupt her development within the expectations placed upon her. This was not simply about responding to what had happened. It was about preventing anything similar from ever happening again. That focus began to ripple outward, shaping discussions that extended beyond the immediate incident. Questions of access emerged: who is allowed within certain spaces, under what conditions, and with what level of oversight. Conversations around titles and privileges, once considered stable, were reportedly revisited with renewed scrutiny, not to create division but to clarify boundaries. Because in a system where proximity to the throne can blur lines, clarity becomes essential. And clarity, in this context, often comes with consequences. What made this moment particularly significant, according to those observing closely, was the broader signal it sent. William was not just responding as a father. He was stepping forward as a future monarch, demonstrating a willingness to act decisively when the structure itself is tested. It was, in many ways, a quiet declaration, one that did not rely on public acknowledgement but carried weight within the institution itself. A shift from reaction to control, from management to leadership. Catherine's role in this transformation, though less visible, was no less important. Reports suggest she remained closely aligned with William's approach, offering not just emotional support, but a shared understanding of what was at stake. Her presence reinforced the decisions being made, adding a layer of unity that strengthened their position. Together, they presented a front that was both composed and resolute, ensuring that the response was not fragmented but cohesive. And as these decisions took shape, the atmosphere within the extended royal circle began to change, subtle at first, then increasingly apparent. Because when authority is asserted in this way, it does not go unnoticed. It creates ripples, shifts expectations, and forces those within its reach to reassess their own positions. The incident, once contained, was now influencing the structure itself. And then came the move that would send shockwaves through the extended royal circle. It wasn't announced publicly. There were no formal statements. But within royal circles, the message was unmistakable. Something had changed. A title once quietly held was no longer recognized in the same way. And the implications reached far beyond a single name. What makes this moment so striking is not the visibility of the decision, but the silence surrounding it. Because in the monarchy, the absence of announcement is often more powerful than any declaration. Reports suggest that a courtesy title, one that had existed in the delicate space between acknowledgement and informality, was suddenly being treated differently. Not stripped in a dramatic gesture, not revoked with ceremony but subtly repositioned. Its relevance diminished, its recognition quietly withdrawn. It was a shift so precise that it could easily be denied, yet so deliberate that it could not be ignored by those who understood its meaning. Within the palace, such adjustments are rarely impulsive. They are calculated, rooted in layers of protocol that stretch back generations. Insiders suggest this was framed not as a reaction, but as a clarification and effort to define the boundaries that had perhaps become too fluid over time. Because as the monarchy evolves, the lines between who is within the core structure and who exists on its edges can blur, and when those lines blur too far, they are redrawn. Not loudly, not abruptly, but firmly. At the center of this recalibration lies a deeper issue: the distinction between royal and non-royal status, particularly among the younger generation. What had once been treated with a degree of flexibility was now being examined with sharper focus. Who carries a title? And more importantly, what that title signifies is no longer being left open to interpretation. It is being defined, reinforced, and in some cases, quietly restricted. And in this case, the message was clear: proximity to the royal family does not automatically translate into standing within its inner hierarchy. For Camilla's side of the family, the response, according to various interpretations, has been one of quiet unease, not publicly expressed, not openly challenged, but felt nonetheless. Because this was not just a technical adjustment, it was a signal, a reminder of where the boundaries lie, and who ultimately has the authority to define them. Insiders describe the reaction as deeply unsettled, not because of the immediate impact, but because of what it suggests for the future. If one title can be reinterpreted, others may follow. If one boundary can be reinforced, others may be drawn more sharply. The palace, however, maintains its position with careful consistency. Those familiar with its internal language suggest the move is being framed as a procedural part of an ongoing effort to ensure clarity and stability within the structure. Not emotional, not reactive, but necessary. And yet, even within that framing, the weight of the decision is unmistakable, because procedure, in this context, is not neutral. It is power expressed through formality. It is authority exercised without confrontation. Observers outside the palace walls have begun to take notice as well. Debate is growing, not about the specifics, those remain carefully obscured, but about the precedent. What does it mean when titles shift without explanation? What does it suggest about the evolving nature of the monarchy? And perhaps most importantly, who decides where those lines are drawn? These questions, while speculative, reflect a broader awareness that something fundamental is being adjusted, even if the details remain just out of reach. And as this quiet transformation continues to unfold, one thing becomes increasingly clear. This is not an isolated decision. It is part of a larger movement, one that speaks to control, to structure, and to the careful preservation of a system that does not easily adapt, but when it does so with intention. But this wasn't just about titles, it was about power, legacy, and who truly belongs within the inner circle. For Camilla, the situation carried a different kind of weight, because what unfolded wasn't just about children, it was about influence. And for the first time in months, insiders began to question just how much control she still held within the evolving structure of the monarchy. What had once been a carefully balanced position now appeared far more fragile. Camilla's role, long understood as a quiet mediator between branches of the family, suddenly came under a level of scrutiny that had not been visible before. Reports suggest that private discussions began to take shape behind closed-doors conversations not centered on blame, but on stability. Senior figures, those who rarely involved themselves in day-to-day tensions, were said to be reviewing the situation with measured concern. Because when influence is tested in this way, it does not just affect relationships, it affects structure. For years, Camilla had operated within a delicate space, bridging gaps that others could not easily cross. Her connection to the Parker Bowles line, combined with her position within the royal hierarchy, allowed her to move between worlds that often remained separate. But now, that very role was being reconsidered. Not openly challenged, not directly diminished, but quietly questioned. Because if the bridge itself becomes a point of tension, its purpose must be reevaluated. Observers have noted subtle changes, the kind that are easy to overlook unless one is paying close attention. Public appearances, once marked by a certain ease, now carry a trace of distance. Interactions that once seemed natural now feel measured, as though every word is being chosen with greater care. It is not dramatic, it is not confrontational, but it is there. And in an environment where even the smallest shift can signal something larger, it has not gone unnoticed. Within the broader royal structure, analysts suggest that this moment reflects a deeper recalibration. The monarchy, as it moves toward its next chapter, is redefining its internal dynamics. Power is not being transferred in a single motion, but adjusted gradually, almost imperceptibly. And in that adjustment, roles that once seemed secure are being reassessed. Camilla's position, while still significant, is now part of that process. Not removed, not replaced, but reshaped in ways that may not yet be fully visible. At the same time, there remains a clear effort to maintain unity. The palace understands the risks of visible division, especially in moments that attract attention from beyond its walls. Messages, both public and private, continue to emphasize cohesion, continuity, and shared purpose. But beneath that surface, the reality is more complex. Unity, in this context, is not the absence of tension, it is the management of it. And that management requires careful balance. Particularly when influence is in flux, questions are now being asked not loudly, not publicly, but persistently. What does this mean for the extended family members who exist just beyond the core? How will their roles be defined moving forward? And perhaps most importantly, who will determine those definitions? Because as the monarchy evolves, the space between inclusion and distance becomes increasingly significant. It is not just about who is present, it is about who belongs, and under what terms. For Camilla, this is a moment of quiet pressure. Not a confrontation, not a crisis, but a shift. A recognition that influence, no matter how established, is never entirely fixed. It must be maintained, adapted, and sometimes defended. And as the internal dynamics continue to adjust, her position within that structure remains both important and uncertain. As tensions quietly recalibrated behind palace walls, the focus returned to the future and who would shape it. At its core, this was never just about a single moment. It was about the future of the monarchy itself. And those closest to the throne understood that even the smallest fracture, if left unchecked, could ripple outward in ways impossible to contain. What began as a contained situation quickly evolved into something far more. Deliberate, quiet, but unmistakable tightening of structure around the next generation. Reports suggest that boundaries surrounding the Wales children were not just reinforced, but redefined with a level of precision that signaled long-term intent. Access became more controlled, interactions more carefully considered. It wasn't a reaction driven by fear, but by foresight. Because within an institution built on continuity, The protection of those who will inherit its weight is not optional, it is essential. This shift was not loud. It did not rely on announcements or visible changes that could be easily identified from the outside. Instead, it unfolded through subtle adjustments that carried significant meaning. Invitations, once extended with flexibility, were now filtered through stricter considerations. Environments, previously shared, were recalibrated to ensure consistency and control. Advisors, according to those familiar with internal dynamics, placed renewed emphasis on maintaining spaces where protocol is not just followed, but embedded into every interaction. Because in moments like this, consistency becomes the strongest form of stability. There was also a broader recognition taking shape behind palace walls. Short-term perception, while important, was no longer the priority. The focus had shifted to longevity, how decisions made now would influence the monarchy years, even decades, into the future. Those guiding this process were not simply responding to an isolated event. They were addressing the potential for disruption, ensuring that what had occurred could not evolve into a pattern. And that required more than correction. It required recalibration. Within this evolving framework, William and Catherine's roles became increasingly defined, not just as parents navigating a challenging moment, but as central figures in shaping what comes next. Insiders suggest that their approach is being viewed as a model measured, controlled, and deeply aligned with the principles that have long sustained the institution. They are no longer simply part of the system. They are actively shaping it, setting standards that extend beyond their immediate responsibilities. And in doing so, they are positioning themselves as guardians of a future that must remain both stable and adaptable. This positioning extends into the internal structure as well. Access to royal spaces and events, once guided by tradition and familiarity, is now being reassessed with greater clarity. Who is present, under what circumstances, and with what level of proximity is no longer left to assumption. It is being defined, not as a restriction, but as a necessity. Because in a system where visibility carries meaning, every presence must align with purpose. And that alignment, once disrupted, must be restored with intention. The message emerging from all of this is both clear and complex. Discipline is not being imposed as a response to failure. It is being reinforced as a safeguard for continuity. The monarchy, in its current form, cannot afford ambiguity in its internal structure. It must operate with clarity, with consistency, and with a shared understanding of what is expected from those within its reach. And that understanding is now being strengthened in ways that may not be visible, but are deeply felt. Yet even as these measures take hold, creating a renewed sense of order and direction, something lingers beneath the surface. Because moments like this, once they occur, do not simply disappear. They leave traces subtle, persistent, and difficult to fully erase. And in those traces lies the reminder that stability, no matter how carefully maintained, is always subject to challenge. And yet, even as order was restored, the echoes of what happened refused to fully fade. No official statement ever came. No confirmation. No denial. Just a carefully maintained silence, the kind that often speaks louder than words. Because within that silence, those paying attention could still hear the lingering question: what really happened behind those doors? In the days that followed, that silence did not fade, it deepened. It settled over every conversation, every appearance, every carefully measured interaction, like an invisible boundary no one was willing to cross. The palace, known for its ability to manage narrative with precision, held its position firmly. There would be no clarification, no attempt to reshape the story, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had taken place. And yet, that very absence began to fuel something far more persistent. Because when information is withheld at this level, it does not disappear. It transforms. It lingers. It grows. Media speculation, though cautious, refused to fully retreat. Observers dissected moments that might otherwise have passed unnoticed. A pause in conversation, a shift in tone, a subtle change in proximity during public engagements. None of it definitive, none of it confirmed. But together, it formed a pattern that invited interpretation. Reports suggested that those closest to royal coverage were being unusually restrained, as though an unspoken understanding had been reached. This was not a story to be pursued directly, but one that would exist in the space between what is seen and what is said. The palace, for its part, maintained control with remarkable discipline. Appearances continued. Engagements were fulfilled. The rhythm of royal life moved forward, unchanged on the surface. But beneath that continuity, there was a noticeable precision in how everything was presented. Public moments were shorter, interactions more contained. The Wales family, in particular, appeared with a level of cohesion that felt intentional, as though every detail had been considered in advance. It was not an attempt to erase what had happened, but to ensure that it remained exactly where it was meant to be, out of reach. And yet, even with that control, the impact could not be entirely concealed, because moments like this do not simply vanish. They leave traces, not always visible, not always measurable, but present nonetheless. Within the institution, those traces continue to shape decisions in ways that may never be publicly acknowledged. Access remains more carefully managed. Boundaries, once adjusted, are not easily relaxed. And the quiet recalibration that began in response to a single incident now extends into the broader structure, influencing how relationships are defined and maintained. What makes this particularly significant is not the event itself, but what it represents in the long term. Because within the monarchy, turning points are rarely marked by grand declarations. They emerge quietly, through shifts that only become clear over time. This, many believe, is one of those moments, not dramatic in its exposure, but profound in its implications. A moment where something changed not visibly, not officially, but undeniably. And perhaps that is what makes it so compelling. The absence of resolution, the lack of closure, the understanding that some stories are not meant to be completed, but to remain suspended, influencing everything that follows without ever being fully understood. Because in the world of royalty, it's not always what is said, but what is never allowed to be spoken that defines the truth. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.